Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to try to do something a little crazy. Condense the entire sprawling history of the United States into just 5 minutes. So buckle up, because it's a story of radical, constant change. Long before the United States was even a glimmer of an idea, this continent was not some empty wilderness. No way. It was a vibrant, bustling world, home to this incredible mosaic of indigenous nations that had thrived here for literally thousands of years.
So that's the big question, right? How did this land, this continent of hundreds of nations, become one? Well, in this explainer, we're going to trace the key transformations that really shaped the country we know today.
All right, let's dive in. First things first, we need to understand who was here long before any European ships even appeared on the horizon. Okay, so let's rewind the clock, way back. We're talking tens of thousands of years ago, during the Ice Age. The first Americans made this incredible journey from Asia, crossing a land bridge called Beringia. From there, they fanned out across the continents, diversifying into hundreds of totally distinct cultures, each one brilliantly adapted to its own environment.
And listen, these weren't just small, scattered bands of people. Not at all. We are talking about massive urban centers. Take Cahokia, for example. At its peak, it was actually larger than London was at the same time. You've got these incredible cliff dwellings built by the Pueblo peoples, and you have incredibly sophisticated political structures, like the Iroquois Confederacy. Its system of government is even thought to have influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution. Just amazing.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now let's move on to the next chapter, which was a violent, continent-altering interruption, the arrival of Europeans. So by the 1600s, the race was on. It was a full-on scramble to claim a piece of North America. You had Spain, England, the Netherlands. They all jumped in and staked their claims, each with totally different goals. And this, right here, set the stage for centuries of conflict to come.
And this really gets at the core contradiction of colonization. It was two-faced. On one hand, you did have moments of negotiation and treaty-making. But on the other, you had brutal, devastating violence and the absolutely catastrophic impact of diseases that the indigenous peoples had no immunity to. It was a collision of worlds, and it was tragic.
Now let's focus on the British colonies, because they're really the seed of what becomes the United States. And they weren't all the same. They developed these three really distinct regional identities. Up in New England, it was all about commerce and religion. The middle colonies were this incredible melting pot of different cultures and faiths. And then there was the South, defined by its huge agricultural economy, a reality that would have, well, profound consequences. And this is the crucial point. That Southern economy became completely dependent on chattel slavery. And we need to be clear what that means. A system where human beings were legally considered property. This wasn't a side note in the story, it was the story. It was the central economic engine, and it embedded this deep, violent contradiction right at the very heart of a nation supposedly founded on liberty. So, that brings up a really interesting question. How did these 13 separate, often squabbling colonies ever get it together to unite and take on one of the mightiest empires on Earth? Well, it all started with an idea. Imagine this. You just fought alongside Britain in a huge war against France. And then, as a thank you, London starts hitting you with direct taxes, like the Stamp Act. But here's the kicker. You have 0 representatives in their parliament. So the slogan, "No taxation without representation," wasn't just catchy. It became an explosive rallying cry. And things escalated quickly. Protests went from just words to direct, in-your-face action. The Boston Tea Party was this huge, dramatic act of defiance. Of course, Britain's response was swift and harsh. They basically put Massachusetts under military rule, with a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. But that just backfired and united the colonists even more. Then, in 1776, came the definitive response, the Declaration of Independence. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a list of complaints. It was a breathtakingly radical vision for a whole new kind of government, one based on liberty, equality, and the idea that the government gets its power from the people. I mean, these ideas would go on to inspire freedom movements all over the world. But ideas are one thing. Winning them on the battlefield is another. The Revolutionary War was this long, brutal, grueling struggle. But against all odds, the Continental Army, led by George Washington, and with some absolutely crucial help from France, managed to defeat a global superpower. And that victory, it didn't just lead to independence. It led to the creation of the United States Constitution, a whole new blueprint for a republic.
So, the new nation is born. But its next great transformation was just around the corner. And it involved a massive and deeply conflicted push westward that would truly test those founding ideals to their breaking point.
And when I say the country grew, I mean it grew at an absolutely astonishing pace. In 1803, you have the Louisiana Purchase, and poof, the nation literally doubles in size overnight. They just unleashed a relentless flood of settlers heading west, all chasing that promise of cheap land and a new start.
Now, this massive push west was fueled by a really powerful and frankly dangerous idea: manifest destiny. It was this belief that American settlers were basically destined by God to expand across the entire continent. And it became the ideological justification for all sorts of things, including the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands and even a war of conquest against Mexico.
But here's that contradiction again. This huge expansion of American freedom was shadowed by the country's original sin. With every single new piece of territory that was added, one question just loomed larger and larger. Will it be a free state or will it be a slave state? Will slavery be allowed to expand right along with the nation? That single question eventually tore the nation apart. The Civil War was, and still is, the country's absolute bloodiest conflict. The North fought to preserve the Union. The South fought to preserve the institution of slavery. In the end, the Union victory did preserve the nation and it did abolish slavery, but the human cost was just staggering. We're talking about scars that in many ways are still felt today.
Okay, so let's get to our final transformation. How did this reunited but deeply scarred nation rise from the ashes of the Civil War to become the world's dominant power?
The next 100 years or so were just a whirlwind. The U.S. explodes into this industrial powerhouse fueled by massive waves of immigration. It goes through the wild highs of the Roaring '20s, the crushing lows of the Great Depression, and gets dragged into two absolutely devastating world wars. And somehow, through all of that chaos and turmoil, it emerges as a true global leader.
And then, when the Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War ends, that's it. America is left standing as the world's sole superpower. By the end of the 20th century, its economic, cultural, and military influence was simply unparalleled. It was felt in pretty much every corner of the globe.
So there you have it. From a continent of hundreds of nations to a single global superpower. The history of the United States is this incredible story of constant and often violent transformation. It's still this ongoing, often contentious, experiment in democracy. Which leads us with the big question, right? After nearly 250 years, what's the next transformation?